Tim, so much for joining us today. Coming to the table, we have Tim Cummins, and Tim is the founder and president of IACCM, an organization that I have known for years. It's an exciting organization with, I think, about 52,000 members globally today. So, first and foremost, Tim, thank you ever so much for taking out the time joining us today for this session. You are in England right now, and I'm sitting here in the US. So, Tim, could I ask you very briefly just to introduce yourself and the organization that you founded and are the president of today?
Yeah, Keld, thank you, and pleasure to be with you. So, from a personal background point of view, as you rightly say, I'm currently the president of IACCM, the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management, which I founded now. In fact, this will be its 20th year this year.
Wow.
So it's been by far the longest piece of my career path. But prior to that, my original background was in finance before I stumbled into the world of contracts and commercial management in first automotive, then aerospace, and then the technology sector. So my personal role, certainly in negotiation, has been fairly extensive, ranging from trucks, tractors, and miscellaneous components through to commercial aircraft, through to large systems sales and sort of technology implementations. So the association itself, well, our role and mission is relatively simple. It is to raise the quality and integrity of trading relationships. And as you will well know, Keld, negotiation plays a pretty major role in whether or not we do in fact have successful trade which operates with integrity.
Sure. Tim, IACCM are hosting conferences around the world, and I remember I was attending the Americas conference in October here in the US, and I remember that you were on stage saying in front of the whole audience that negotiation is dead. Could you share with me just briefly your thoughts on that?
Yes, you did comment afterwards that you were a little bit shocked. Yes, well, of course, as you well know, because I know that you're a master at this as well, one sometimes has to say shocking things in order to gain attention. Is it quite that extreme? No, but I think negotiation in the way that we've traditionally thought about it is indeed on its final legs. And I think that, a lot of the traditional negotiation work, such as getting to yes, are looking increasingly anachronistic. Why I say that is because we've moved to a world which is now predominantly based around services rather than goods. And services agreements and negotiations are very different from those for tangible products. So there are a number of aspects to it. On one side, of course, you could say in the services agreement, negotiation never dies. In other words, it's just a continuous negotiation and renegotiation as you get to the realities of performance and as you need to deal with change. So actually, negotiation just becomes an embedded reality. It isn't a phase, a moment in time, which is traditionally being depicted. But on the other side, I would say that we're going to see, and are starting to see, more in the way of automated systems undertaking those negotiations. So again, it may not be dead, but it may not require that much in terms of human intervention to support. So I think we're just seeing some real shifts of emphasis and nature in the field of negotiation. And my feeling is that the majority of the text and training have simply not kept pace with the market.
Yeah. So, Tim, my next question in relation to that would be, how do you see the future? And by future, I mean within the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Do you think that negotiation would replace humans with technology to a certain degree? And would that mean that people in contract management and procurement would have to do less negotiation and more of something else?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer. Yeah.
So,
How do you see technology making an impact?
so where of course it's starting to, well, where it's starting to make an impact is probably in two levels. One, um, there are relatively simple areas of negotiation which of course can be automated. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. One would be in the area of what we term optioneering. So, for example, rather than me just offering you a completely standardized set of terms and conditions, I may give you some choices in terms of, for example, your preference on payment terms, or your preference on the period of warranty, or your preference in terms of the, availability or uptime of a particular offering. Of course, depending upon what you choose, that will have a consequent impact on certain other terms, such as the price. But that can be readily automated. Similarly, in a business-to-business negotiation, where perhaps you've got 3 or 4 specific items, maybe I'm interested in the delivery date, maybe interested in the warranty terms, and perhaps I'm interested in the payment terms. There you can again get fairly simple automated processes that enable the parties to input their preferences, and for the machines to essentially communicate with each other and negotiate the best resolution, the optimum result for each party. And we've again started to see that. In fact, there's a company in Germany, which I understand is automating through Internet of Things type technology for containers to negotiate with each other as they pass each other, and maybe look at different load distributions. So I think all of those are really exciting developments. Another area that's going to impact that for the traditional legal procurement contracts function is that technology is also revealing, Keld, and you're well aware of this, the amount of time that is spent on, really, to be honest, wasted negotiation. We spend our time debating endlessly over, for example, a choice of words that actually mean just the same thing. So we're also beginning to get much more evidence and visibility into that through things like natural language processing and the ability to eliminate many of the inefficiencies that probably make up, I would suggest, 50 to 60% of most of today's negotiation.
That's a lot. Interesting.
What it gives a chance to, of course, is to move to the things that really matter, the real causes of downstream value loss, the failure, for example, to build in appropriate mechanisms to manage scope and goals, to agree the responsibilities of the parties, to ensure appropriate risk allocation. Lots of things that really, again, as you well know, are actively looked at in so many negotiations, and which represent the source of subsequent contention, blame, and loss of value.
Tim, as you probably know, one of my angles into negotiation and around negotiation is trust. And studies, not only my studies, but studies globally have shown that trust has been declining for years. And I claim that trust is essential to be really successful in a negotiation. Now, combining the discussion on trust and technology, do you believe that technology will improve and support the increase of trust, or would it actually make trust even worse? Or how do you see that?
Yeah, as you know, Keld, and I think it's, again, a topic of our big debate in 2019. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because obviously there are ways in which technology, some of the challenges that have been around social media and Facebook, but these are all driven, of course, by human decisions. It's not the technology making questionable decisions, it's humans. And that's always going to be a concern, and I think where you're raising that question is, if people can hide behind technology, does that actually make them less trustworthy?
Mm.
and and sadly, the answer to that is often yes. It seems it does.
Yeah.
That the propensity to tell lies is greater if they're not having to look you in the face to do it.
Sure.
But the counter side of that is that, of course, the machines themselves don't have emotions. They have no inclination to
Mm.
lie,
Mm.
to distort. They are not going to be abusive.
Mm.
Well, it depends, I suppose, on how they're programmed, because I believe that Alexa or one of those systems did become abusive. But I mean, the core, I think, to trust is a combination of empathy, honesty, and openness.
Mm.
Can we program machines to do that? Well, to a degree, we can.
Mm. Mm.
But I think you're absolutely right that, in and of themselves or in and of itself, technology is not going to deal with the trust issue.
Mm. Mm. Tim, in general, and this might be a difficult question. Do you think that you and I and human beings in general, are we good at negotiations?
um, well, human beings in general is a little bit broad, of course, Keld. I mean, the reality, one part, I suppose, of what one defines as negotiation. I mean, from my point of view, I suppose a negotiation is really pretty much any situation where the parties share some level of common interest, but they need to establish a common view or approach on the terms or how to achieve it. So it's very wide ranging. I mean, negotiation is something you want to take, for example, within an organization as well as between organizations.
Absolutely.
It's something you want to take with your children on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
My suspicion, Keld, is that most of us are probably better at some forms of negotiation than others.
Mm.
I mean, at a personal level, for example, I would say that I'm much better at negotiating when I'm doing it on somebody else's behalf than I am when I'm doing it on my own.
Mm.
If I go into a car show to buy a car, I'm a lousy negotiator. If I'm negotiating a multi-billion-dollar deal on behalf of IBM, I think I was pretty good.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right about that, and that actually leads me on to the next question. Are we aware in our life situation when we should negotiate on our own negotiation or when we should let somebody else negotiate? Because exactly, I completely agree with you, Tim. We tend to be obviously irrational and sometimes emotional. So if it's something that is important to us emotionally, we may not be as good as we could be. I sometimes use the phrase that we are unconsciously incompetent in some cases. That means obviously that we don't know what we don't know. And is that what you find sometimes with negotiators, that if they're conscious and focused on their negotiation, they might be good at it, but if it becomes more emotional or personal, that it actually becomes less of a real success?
Yeah, I think that probably is true. Again, I guess it depends somewhat on the situation. I think you only have to look at some of the more contentious. The more invested people are in a situation, the more history there is behind it, the less they are able, I suppose, to step aside and just reach resolution. And I mean, obvious extreme examples of that, I suppose, would be things like the sort of various truth commissions, for example, in South Africa or in Ireland, where really there was never going to be a breakthrough unless and until you brought in external independent parties who could really act. And I think this is something that comes out, of course, in our paper, Negotiation is Dead, which is where we suggest that the future for a lot of negotiation is actually more akin to mediation. And that we need an objective party who can steer the counterparties to the solution that is actually in their mutual interest, but
Mm.
with history and embedded attitudes and power dynamics make it
Mm.
often very
Mm.
difficult for people to get out of their own way.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very good point, Tim. Tim, you're one of the people I know that are traveling the most. You're everywhere on the face of the globe with your members, everywhere from Australia, Asia, Europe, and the Americas, obviously. So I think you're the right person to ask this question. How do you see this cross-cultural negotiation? How can they be different and more challenging than if you're just negotiating with somebody that lives in the same town or city or even country as yourself?
Yeah. Yes, in a way, I may be the right, and in some ways, I may be the wrong person to ask, because I suppose I've done it so many times now that
Mm.
it's, as with all of these things, it becomes second nature, doesn't
Mm.
it?
I understand. Yeah.
I think, for me, the international negotiations or dialogues and communication is more interesting because I suppose it has that added dimension of exploration. Um, So, I mean, I suppose, Keld, one of the key things is to recognize that, of course, it is different, and not just to try to take your traditional methods and behaviors from your own culture and just superimpose them externally.
Mm.
Uh, it is a matter of showing respect. It is
Mm.
back to a point of empathy.
Mm.
Um, but it's also, of course, about elements of doing your homework and understanding when a nod means yes and when it actually means no.
Mm.
Understanding the power dynamics of different cultures and,
Mm.
the likelihood that your counterparty actually has authority to agree particular things.
Mm.
It, probably international negotiation is something that is you need to be a good listener, you need to be a good observer,
Mhm.
you need to have a genuine interest in, I think, the counterparty and their perspectives. You need to show respect,
Mm.
uh, and and I guess a degree of just just friendliness, but I don't want that to be mistaken. I mean, obviously, you're not making every negotiator your friend, but
Mm. Mm.
it is back to your point. You've got a job to do to generate trust.
Mm. Okay. Now, I know it is always dangerous, obviously, to generalize, but if we should try and generalize just for a second, Tim, based on your lifelong experience and global traveling, do you find that some cultures are just naturally better at negotiation than others?
Depends what negotiation, I suppose. I mean, some are certainly um, very targeted.
Mm.
um, I mean, there are certainly cultures where, for example, the focus on price is unrelenting.
Mm.
Uh, so, are they good at driving down? Maybe I can give you a quick example here, Kel.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one of the first negotiations I undertook was actually in Morocco.
Mm.
It was I was selling or negotiating the sale of a large volume of engines, truck engines, and we travelled out. We met with our counterparties, to senior executives of the company, who insisted that the negotiation be held in French.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever they wanted to have side conversation, they went off into Arabic,
Mm-hmm.
and we knew perfectly well that if we ever had a side conversation in English, that they perfectly understood what we were saying, even though they pretended they didn't.
Mm.
So, really interesting negotiation tactics before
Mm-hmm.
you begin. But,
Mm.
this was an unrelenting focus on driving down price, and
Mm.
everything we tried to bring in, of any source of value, it all came back to, well, what's a lower price?
Mm.
So it reached a point where eventually I turned to the sales rep and I said, we can't go any further.
Mm.
Um, And even he reluctantly accepted that. We got up, we were very polite. We said, so sorry we couldn't reach an agreement, but you know where we are if you need. And we left. When we got back to the office the next day, and this was still the days of the fax, a fax was awaiting us saying we accept. So what was the lesson out of that? Well, they'd certainly been very successful in driving us down to the bottom line. And I guess for them, the only thing that was going to indicate that we really had reached the bottom was when we walked away.
Interesting.
Was that successful negotiation? Yeah, interesting. From their point of view, I guess, on that particular parameter, yes,
Yeah. Okay. Was that a surprise to you then that they actually accepted the deal based partly on you walking away?
Yeah, well, I think it was. It was very early in my particular career, and I think it was probably the second negotiation I'd ever really been involved with. So to be thrown into that particular environment was certainly quite a learning experience.
Yeah. Now, the next question, Tim, you don't have to mention any specific areas, but have you in your career found that some cultures or areas in the world are more trustworthy than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, but not necessarily where you'd expect. Let me give you an example, Keld. We hear a lot about have certainly historically heard a lot about China and its propensity to steal intellectual property as if this is some evil that is unique to China. I'm going to make two observations in that context. I think a lot of what we consider at a moment in time to be fair or ethical or balanced depends upon our own particular situation. And, I think it's very interesting that, for example, the United States had no qualms whatsoever about stealing intellectual property from Europe in the 19th century when its own economy was still growing and when their technology was way behind that of Europe. So, a lot of our value systems tend to depend upon where we are in the economic pecking order. And if I was presiding, rather like the moral debates, I suppose, over the cost of pharmaceuticals in Africa, if I'm looking around and seeing my people dying, I do have to say, just hold on a minute, what ethical code are we living by here?
Sure.
Similarly, I think it's very interesting, taking a Chinese perspective, is the extent to which, certainly again in the past, many Western corporations have looked at China as a source of low-cost manufacturing. The instant that they find a cheaper price, they felt no hesitation in breaking their contract on the basis that, well, what are you going to do about it? So I think we're very selective often in the way we look at our ethical standards. And certainly if I were one of those countries which is often accused of lacking perhaps honesty and ethical principles, there are many points that I could make that say, well, I'm not sure that you really have that many either.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer, Tim. Would you in that aspect, I just get inspired here, would you in that aspect say that ethics is something that we can do or maintain if we can afford it? And if we had a lower ranking financially, we have to trade ethics in? Is that your experience?
No, I don't think it's what I'm saying at all, really. I think,
as
I said, I think there are I think there are different perspectives on what is ethical. So, those who are lower down the economic chain, yeah, there may be levels of, if you like, the opportunism may be quite prevalent, but I would say that opportunism is there in the wealthier economies too. In, for example, the view that I can negotiate from a position of power, and therefore you will accept my terms and conditions because I'm bigger and more powerful than you, and if you don't, I'm going to punish you.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that ethical? You know, so I think we come back to your earlier question of what have I learned in doing business internationally? It's to stop making value judgments in that same way and recognize that a lot of these down to issues of perspective and where you happen to sit at a particular moment in time.
Yeah, that's a very good advice. Thank you, Tim. Tim, in general, and again, we're generalizing, do you find that leaders make better negotiators? And if you do, why? And if you don't, why?
It's always ironic, isn't it? I know in many of the corporations I've worked in that it was always the belief, and often seemed to be borne out by fact, that the more senior the person who negotiated the agreement, the more likely it was to fail.
Yeah.
I think most leaders believe themselves to be good negotiators, and in some contexts that may be true. I think where it often falls apart is that they, you know, my experience very often, Keld, is that leaders really don't have the time or the attention span that is required to really get to detail of what the negotiation was about and what really was agreed. And all too often, you know, they used to come back with an agreement written on a napkin because they'd agreed some wonderful deal over dinner. But without, of course, either of the executives really having given consideration to the broader capabilities of the organization or the implications of the implementation of what it was they thought that they had agreed. For me, a successful negotiation, and this is increasingly true, is one which really gets into understanding the compatibility, the affinity, the integrity, if you like, of the organizational models. How are we going to bring our respective organizations together in a way that is going to work for both of us? It's easy at the big level. You know, you and I could sit here tomorrow and could agree, hey, Cal, wouldn't it be wonderful if we started marketing all your negotiation programs for you? Oh, yes, you say that would be wonderful. But what are the practical implications of that? How do we actually make that happen? How do we turn it to something substantive? You know, those unfortunately are the sorts of things that leaders frequently don't get into. So certainly when it comes to substantive negotiation, I think my answer would be no.
Right. Tim, the typical member of IACCM, correct me if I'm wrong, that would be a contract manager, a procurement officer, or somebody in legal, that type of work. If you should look at the total number of members you got globally today, what would you tell them is the greatest challenge or change that they're going to experience within the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I've just actually, Kel, come off a webinar where we were talking about exactly that topic. So I can send you a paper on the subject. You know, I think it is emerging technologies. I think it is certainly when it comes to contract negotiation, and of course that is a new form of negotiation. I think for the sort of reasons I've been outlining, I think we're going to see the emergence of much more in the way of contracting standards and principles that will assist us in streamlining the contracting process, including the underlying negotiation. I think data analytics is going to give us much better understanding of the things that typically go wrong, and therefore reorient many of our negotiations to dealing with and preempting problems. I think also reconfirm to us that actually negotiation occurs across the life cycle and not at a moment in time. So that raises interesting questions around how do you embed the relational characteristics into your agreements that really give you, in a sense, almost quasi-negotiation. You know, how do you undertake periodic review for example, whereby you deal with the recurrent issues or the opportunities for improvement, which then become, if you like, an extension of that original negotiation. The next 5 years, I think, is one of phased but very significant change.
Okay, right. We're just wrapping up, Tim, but I have one more question. That is perhaps a crucial one, because if you should give one important advice to anybody that are involved in negotiation or about to embark on the road into negotiation, what would that advice be based on everything that you know and you experienced in life?
Do you know, I think the one thing that probably many of us believe when we start out as negotiators, that good negotiation is about us winning. And it isn't. It's about both parties emerging, feeling that there is a shared victory, that there has been mutual benefit. Because with that, you're going to get a sustainable relationship and a sustainable implementation and delivery. Now, of course, if you're negotiating on a one-off basis and I'm just trying to, sell you a second-hand car and I'm moving 2,000 miles away tomorrow, I may take a slightly different view because, to be honest, I don't expect to ever see you again. I don't care whether or not you get a good deal. But hopefully, even then, our moral sense would not wish you to be a complete loser. But I really think the most important point is to rid yourself of the idea that you can emerge as a unilateral winner.
Wonderful. Tim, just before we cut off, if our audience have an interest in IACCM, where can they learn some more? What would be the first natural step for them? Well,
the first natural step, I guess, Keld, is the website at www.iaccm.com. Obviously, it explains a lot about what we do and where people can gain from us. And certainly for those of the listeners who want to just take it one step further at an easy level, we do run twice a year. We run free to join MOOCs, massive open online courses, which start to take people more and more into this whole field of trading relationships.
Is there anything specific that you think could be useful for the audience?
If I may, I'm going to give a couple of quick examples. One is there was actually a negotiation between IBM and Coca-Cola some 25 years ago now. But it was very much a lost cause in principle. We were in a situation where, the return on investment from IT at Coca-Cola had been a source of continuous disappointment. And as the major supplier, it was obviously easy and convenient for many of the internal staff to point the finger at IBM. So in a competitive bid, IBM had actually come on the third place on the floor and looked like it was on its way out. But there was a particular far-sighted executive there who said, look, I really think that IBM is the organization that has the capability we need. I'm really nervous about making this switch. And it happened to be somebody that I'd worked with quite a lot on, with mutually interested on the business impacts of globalization. And so he asked if I, despite my role, my job had nothing to do with Coca-Cola at that point. I was with IBM in a very different role. So he asked if I could come and lead on the negotiation. One of the most important points there, Keld, was that the way we built trust was actually through the use of early implementation of web-based technology. Because what we realized was the real problem was a performance issue with the weaknesses of communication and transparency and visibility around issues of performance. So things like the underlying ordering processes, things like the transparency of pricing across the 202 countries where Coca-Cola to implement a system, the fact that they were often dealing with franchises and we were often dealing with agents and remarketers meant that you had a really complicated network of supply that no visibility into. And in fact, by deploying systems, we were able to raise confidence in the fact that delivery would occur and people would have visibility into what was going on. And through that, we built performance and trust. So
very interesting.
Really interesting that, you know, our negotiation took a very different line than that which would traditionally have been expected, and was not based around trying to drive performance through negative incentives like high levels of penalty, but actually driving it through positive investment in a shared system. So I think that's perhaps an interesting example.
It is. It's very good. It's very good. Who was the main driver in doing that? Was that Coca-Cola, IBM, or really both parties?
It was our mutual recognition because of the work we'd done on globalization and the perhaps the realization that both of us had that at that point in time, no organization anywhere had really adjusted itself to dealing in a global environment. So, you know, big corporates were still really driven through independent profit centers, which had no real ability or motivation to cooperate with each other. So you needed this sort of overarching system, which created, you'll recall, one of our focus areas last year was what we were calling relationship resource planning. Because even today, if you look at the implementation of systems within corporates, driving internal availability, internal visibility and internal communication. Still devoid of any real substantive systems that really support inter-organizational communication and performance oversight. And only now we're beginning to get the beginnings of systems that really begin to give us that sort of ability.
Sure. Tim, have you met organizations where you feel they have a kind of internal negotiation strategy?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things, so actually another of your questions have been around, you know, what would I consider was perhaps my greatest success in negotiation? And ironically, it was exactly that. It was an internal negotiation.
Okay,
And it was embedding principles for ongoing internal negotiations. So in fact, part of the corporate re-engineering to create a global contracting process at IBM, which of course, for the reasons I just outlined, was an item of great contention because it really cut away at the power and independence of the country fiefdoms and of the individual product and service units that suddenly were having to be more open and cooperative with each other. But we could only achieve that, obviously, by setting up some rules of the game, determining who had authority to commit what on whose behalf and how that was going to be done, what the process was going to be for streamlining the management of exceptions. So those sort of intercompany principles today are very common.
Very interesting. Well, working with your members and clients globally, Tim, do you find that organizations in general being aware of having an internal negotiation strategy?
I don't think they would think of it that way, Keld. I mean, they do mostly have, obviously, some internal review and approval type processes. They may have, they will typically have some sort of playbook that indicates who owns, a sort of racy type approach to different clauses or terms within a clause. So, who, for example, has the authority to agree a non-standard payments term. So So, in a sense, they have set up, if you like, those negotiation principles, but they probably don't express it that way.
Right. Tim, IACCM are publishing annually the most negotiated terms in negotiation. Could you just share very briefly what that very interesting study is all about?
Yes, indeed. So, of course, it is targeted at our members, which means that it is reflective, really, of the negotiations undertaken by the corporate world and government to an extent, although government would often say it doesn't negotiate, it just imposes. But in the corporate world, we are, of course, interested in understanding what is it that people negotiate most frequently? Where do they spend their time negotiating? And that particular study reveals that the unchallenged number one is limitation of liability, and number two, pretty much unchallenged, is indemnities. And, we run off through a list that obviously gets into things like liquidated damages and intellectual property rights, etc. The point of real concern with that is that we tend to focus a disproportionate amount of our negotiation on the consequences when things go wrong, and an inadequate amount on really trying to understand and negotiate the things that would more likely make it go right. And I suppose the double sadness of it is that actually negotiators recognize that they're spending a lot of their time in the wrong place, because when we ask them what are the most important terms, they give us things like scope, goals, responsibilities of the parties, change management procedure. The things that actually are about the practical operation of the agreement, or ensuring that there is clarity and agreement between the parties over what's trying to be achieved. And we're in a bit of a chicken and egg there, because when you don't spend enough time on the operational mechanisms and clarity over what you're trying to do, then of course chances of failure significantly increase. So we do things that actually make failure more likely, and then spend our time trying to deal with the consequence of that failure, not by stepping back and saying, hold on a minute, maybe we need to change what we're focused on.
That's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Well, great comment. Thank you, Tim. Tim, have you got anything else that you think could be relevant to share?
No, I think we've probably covered a lot of ground. I think the only area that I thought was an interesting one that you asked about was experiences in terms of unethical or dishonest behavior. People who perhaps threatening in their behavior. I've certainly had that experience, and others where, as you highlighted, people perhaps not being completely open and honest. I think, my experience there would be that it's important to stay relatively calm in those situations, and equally typically not to call people out directly. Again, it depends. If your conclusion is, I don't want to do business with these people, then of course call them out all you want. And abuse them back. But if you're actually still wanting to try to resurrect something or build something from it, I think it's important to be subtle in the way that you let them know that you are well aware of the fact that they are not telling the truth. If somebody is abusive, I think, one of the techniques I've certainly used is just to become silent and let them fume away all they want to, and at some point they're going to have to give up. Because very often, of course, it's just part of their game. When they see you're not actually rising to the bait, well, it's no longer really worth playing that particular game.
I completely agree with what you're saying, Tim. However, I guess it could be difficult if you have some kind of a temper, couldn't it? If you're sitting in front of somebody who is threatening or aggressive.
Indeed so. but then I guess in that case, you maybe aren't a natural negotiator. Can we go back to one of your earlier questions of, are we all good at negotiation? So I guess if you do tend to react, then maybe it's a good time to either have somebody else do the negotiation, or at least make sure that you have a rather calmer head at your side who perhaps can take over at that point and take control of the situation.
So what you're saying is, Tim, that you're a calm person in a negotiation.
I think I tend to be, but again, often that tends to develop with age as well, because you begin to recognize that a lot of these things are not about you personally or directly you personally. It's all part of a tactic, technique, or I guess you reach the point where you feel sorry for the counterparty because if that's really their nature, that they can't have many very good relationships.
True. That's very true. Wonderful, Tim. Thanks a million. It was really great. I got some outstanding value out of that, and I'm sure that our audience will love every insight you gave us. So thank you so much, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Keld, and great to talk to you. Hope to see you before too long.
Great talking to you too. Take care. See you soon.